Writing and Reading the Story, Lesson 4. We now have our story completed that we told with learners, and we are going to move from oral input to written input, from listening to reading. To accomplish this in a CI storytelling setting, we are going to write several versions of the story, at a minimum 2. This can be a bit challenging, so together, let's work on writing more than one version of the story. The first version we need to work on is the complete version of the story. That's our finished product. How do we get there? There's problems like plot holes. It's very likely that during the story creation process, you ran into plot holes, things that didn't quite work in the story. These are actually fine because it's not that you're writing a work of art here, although I would argue that it is art. Instead, this is a language class, and so it's okay to have some inconsistencies in your story. The better your story is, however, the more likely students are going to buy in. So plot holes might exist that we need to fix. The story structure might not be exactly the way that you want it, and there is a basic story structure we can follow to make writing these stories much easier. That structure is the 3-act structure. In Act 1, you have a main character, and this main character is in the normal world. This main character encounters some sort of a problem that needs solving throughout the remainder of the story. In Act 2, the main character leaves the normal world, leaves home behind, and tries to solve their problem. Oftentimes, this act involves travel, so the character will move from one location to another location in an attempt to solve their problems. Typically, the second act is the longest, and this is where the action happens. There may be trials and tribulations along the way, and those just serve to add more interest to your story. In Act 3, the character solves the problem. Whatever was causing the character's world to fall apart has some sort of resolution. The falling action also happens in Act 3. For a CI story, it's possible that Act 3 lasts only a couple of sentences. I try to limit myself to approximately 250, 300, up to about 500 words for any given story. And so, with that limitation, Act 3 is not going to last very long. Sometimes it's a short paragraph, sometimes it's only a couple of sentences. Once we have the complete version of the story, we can extract shorter versions of that story by deleting sentences that are not essential to the story. So, read through your complete version and take a red pen and cross out anything that's not essential to the story. You boil it down, and what you're left with is a brief version of the story. Some people write 2, 3, 4, 5 versions of the story and build so the most complex version is at the end. I prefer to write just 2 versions of the story. The brief version for me is the only short version learners will read. Beyond that, we'll move to the more complex, complete version of the story. There are some systems that I've discovered over the years and have refined them to make writing these stories easier for me. I teach typically between 3 and 4 preps every quarter, and so it's important to me to be able to write these things efficiently. Otherwise, I'm spending too much time creating materials and not enough time doing other things. So there are some systems to help you keep track. This is especially difficult if you teach 3, 4, 5, 6 classes. It's easy to get lost between the different classes. It's very easy. The first system is a student Scribe. This is very simple, straightforward, and is the easiest way to implement this. Simply ask a student to write down the story as you tell it to the class. Once learners get to a certain level, this is going to be super easy for them, and it's a great way to engage them in the group memory process. This is not my preferred method for several reasons. Often students will misspell things, miss accent marks, miss punctuation, and later when I go to type this up, I might make the same mistake just because I'm copying down what I see without thinking about it. So my preferred method is to summarize as a class. And generally I open up a Word document, project that onto the screen, and then type the story out by asking questions. What was the main character's name? Miguel. What was Miguel like? Oh, Miguel was handsome and tall. Then I have a typed up version all ready to go, which I can edit easily. Another system is Open-Ended Stories. Sometimes you get to the end of a story when you're telling it, and there's no ending. Perhaps the class is burnt out, or maybe they're just not feeling creative that day. So sometimes your story will not have an ending, and to create this ending, there's several things we can do. You can create your own, or students can create their own, or some sort of combination of the two. I have a friend who uses the second option here. Whenever they have an open-ended story that needs an ending later, she has students create their own. And what she does is that she opens up a Google slideshow presentation and makes a slide for every student. A student then goes and writes their name on their slide to claim it, and as homework, they finish the story on their slide. Then she can go back through and read these, edit them, pick her favorite, or perhaps even have the students vote on their favorite ending as a class. Another thing we can talk about is easy wins. It helps when you're writing a lot of stories and a lot of versions of stories to have some easy wins. And let's go through a few of them. When you're writing out a story and you want to fill a word count of 250 to 500 words, an easy win is writing a lot of descriptions. Add more descriptions than you told to the class. This is a good way to teach this vocabulary that you can then incorporate the next time around when you tell the next story. Comparisons. Comparisons is another one. You can write 3 or 4 more sentences by adding comparisons that were not present in the class version of the story. An interesting story is one that involves growth of the main character. The character has to change in some way. So it's important to present the character with some sort of opportunity to grow. Now, the story scripts may provide that and they may not. So it's important that you add this in later if you want a very interesting story. Present the main character with some sort of moral choice, and that's a good way to get that character growth we just talked about. The character has to choose between 2 or more options that have ramifications for them and their moral character. This is another element of making a dynamic character, and often this results in something funny happening. They have 2 choices and they take the funny option. That's something that can increase learner engagement, produce some humor, and lower the affective filter. Common desires. If you have more than one character in the story, which you will often have, it helps to have them be opposed to each other, but also want the same thing. In Lord of the Rings, for example, Frodo wants to destroy the ring, while Sauron wants to get the ring, and pretty much everybody else wants to get the ring. The Ring of Power acts as a focal point for the story. All the characters want it for different reasons, and this greatly increases tension and drama in the story. Once you have written versions of the stories, learners need to read it, and there are several ways that you can have them read the story in the classroom. You can do pair reading, where students read in pairs. I like to do this often, and I have them read every other sentence. So one person reads one sentence, the next person reads the next sentence. Silent reading. Silent reading is great for those students who feel self-conscious about reading out loud. In addition, it gives them more time to process the messages that are being communicated to them in the story. Instructor-only reading. This is a good activity if you want the students to hear the story again, but a version that's been written out. Silent reading plus instructor reading. This is a combination of the previous 2 where the students read on their own, but the instructor reads out loud. So when you listen and read at the same time, your comprehension tends to go up, which is what we're going for in this reading portion anyway. A volunteer reader is an option that you can use where one student volunteers to read. I'm not a huge fan of this because often the student will mispronounce things. So if you're going to read out loud as a whole class, I prefer to read it myself or to have some recording play. And that way students can hear again the correct pronunciation of these words. Lastly, popcorn reader. This is my least favorite option. It's where one student reads a little bit, they stop, another student picks up where they left off, they stop, and so forth. I don't like this option because it's like the volunteer reader where there's going to be mispronunciations, but also you're reading in front of the class, it's kind of disjointed. Some student may be great at it, some other student may not be great at it yet. I feel like it's a confidence buster versus a confidence booster. The key takeaway from this is that reading means more CI, so being able to read versions of the story is incredibly important for your learners going forward. Furthermore, it's a way to connect your teaching to the previous class periods by connecting the same theme, the same vocabulary, and extending it out over more days. This comprehensible repetition will lead to acquisition over time.